A devoted mother walks into an apartment to share her faith, but she never walks out. Days later, her body is found beneath the floorboards, stabbed, beaten, and hidden away. What drove a young man to commit such a brutal act? Was it a clash of beliefs, a moment of uncontrollable rage, or something even darker? This is the chilling case of Mary Stalage. Welcome back to Vic's True Crime Stories. Stay tuned as we go through this gripping story together. Mary Stalage had a way about her, a quiet warmth, a certainty in her steps, a purpose that never wavered. At 51, she had lived a life rooted in faith, raising 4 children with the same steady devotion that guided her every decision. To the world, she was more than a mother. She was a counselor, a comforter, a woman whose kindness extended beyond her own family. Some found her presence reassuring, like a familiar hymn on a Sunday morning. Others, however, felt something else entirely, something less welcoming, something that made them shift in their seats when she spoke. Chicago, Illinois, a city known for its towering skyline, its relentless heartbeat of movement, its ever-changing face. But not every corner of Chicago hummed with the same energy. There were streets where time seemed to slow, where neighbors greeted each other with the ease of old friends, where the city's noise softened into the quiet murmur of daily life. In one such neighborhood, tucked away from the rush of downtown, there was a small funeral home. It was the kind of place most people avoided unless absolutely necessary, a building that held sorrow in its walls, that carried the weight of grief long after its visitors had gone. Mary knew those walls well. She had spent years working at the funeral home, offering prayers, whispering words of comfort to families whose lives had been split in two by loss. Death did not frighten her. It was merely a passage, a doorway leading to something greater. That belief had shaped her, made her the woman she was, the kind who saw people not for what they were in the moment, but for what they could be. It was that belief that brought her to Nicholas Gutierrez. He was young, just 19, barely on the cusp of adulthood, but already burdened with the kind of struggles that made a person feel much older. He lived in the apartment just above the funeral home, a space that should have offered him solitude but instead felt suffocating. A room filled with questions he couldn't answer, a mirror reflecting a version of himself he wasn't sure he wanted to see. Nicholas carried wounds, invisible to those who passed him on the street but deep enough to fester in the quiet hours of the night. Mary had noticed him. She noticed everyone. The way a person held their shoulders, the weight in their voice, the unspoken stories lingering just beneath their words. Nicholas, she believed, was lost. And if there was one thing Mary Stalage couldn't ignore, it was a soul in need of saving. She spoke to him once, a brief conversation that left her convinced there was something she could offer him. Guidance, clarity, redemption. Perhaps all three. Faith had given her a compass, a way to navigate life's uncertainties, and she was certain it could do the same for him. But Nicholas did not see it that way. For him, faith was a burden, an expectation he had spent years trying to escape. He had heard the words before: turn back, seek the light, abandon sin, and each time, they felt less like salvation and more like a weight pressing against his chest. Still, Mary was not the type to give up easily. Conviction ran through her veins, unwavering, unshaken. She believed in second chances, in transformation, in the undeniable power of redemption. And so, on a quiet afternoon in November, she made a decision. She would go to him. She would talk to him. She would save him. Mary Stalage walked into that apartment with certainty in her heart. She never walked out. What happened in that room? Was this the tragic result of a simple disagreement, or was there something deeper, something raw and unresolved, festering in Nicholas Gutierrez's mind long before Mary ever stepped through his door? And the biggest question of all, was Mary's faith the reason she was killed? November 13th began like any other day for Mary Stalage. The air carried the crisp bite of late autumn, and the morning sky held the kind of quiet stillness that made the city feel almost peaceful. She attended morning mass, as she always did, kneeling in the same pew where she had whispered her prayers for years. The scent of incense clung to the air, mingling with the faint flicker of candlelight, and for a moment she sat there in silence, her hands clasped, her eyes closed. Faith was the rhythm of her life, a steady pulse that never wavered, a foundation she stood upon no matter the storms that came her way. But that morning, there was something weighing on her mind. Someone, rather. Nicholas Gutierrez. Their last conversation had stayed with her, lingering in the corners of her thoughts like a book left unfinished. He was troubled, she knew that much. There was a heaviness in his voice, a restlessness in his spirit. She believed she could help him, and perhaps, in some way, she believed it was her duty to try. So, after leaving the church, she made a decision. She would go to him. She would speak to him again, offer him the kind of solace only faith could provide. It wasn't unusual for Mary to visit people in need, to step into places others might avoid, to meet people where they were, no matter how lost they seemed. And so, without hesitation, she made her way toward the funeral home, toward the apartment above, where Nicholas lived in a space that felt more like a prison than a home. Witnesses saw her enter the building that day. A neighbor glanced up from sweeping their porch, watching as she stepped through the doorway. A man passing by noticed her familiar figure, the way she carried herself with quiet confidence. And then, nothing. The hours stretched on, the sun dipped lower, and yet Mary never reappeared. She had walked through that door, but no one saw her leave. When night fell and she still hadn't returned home, her family began to worry. It wasn't like her to disappear without a word, to leave unanswered calls, to stray from her routine without telling someone where she'd gone. Concern turned to fear, fear turned to desperation, and soon a missing persons report was filed. The search for Mary Stalage had begun. Investigators moved quickly, retracing her steps, questioning those who had seen her last. The funeral home was searched, its quiet halls yielding no answers, its empty rooms offering nothing but silence. Employees were questioned, their responses laced with confusion. No, they hadn't seen her leave, no, they hadn't heard anything unusual. But there was one door left unchecked. The apartment upstairs. The place where Nicholas Gutierrez lived. It was there, in that small, suffocating space, that the truth began to unfold. The moment officers stepped inside, something felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with something indescribable. And then, there was the smell. Faint at first, like something just beyond recognition, but with each passing second, it grew stronger, more distinct. It was a scent they knew all too well. The unmistakable stench of death. Their search led them to a corner of the room, to a section of the floor that seemed off. The boards weren't quite flush, the edges misaligned just enough to raise suspicion. With cautious hands, they pried them open, and beneath the floorboards, in the dark, suffocating crawl space, they found her. Wrapped in plastic, hidden away as if her existence could simply be erased. But the truth refused to stay buried. Mary's body bore the marks of brutality. Stab wounds, deep and deliberate. The cruel imprint of strangulation around her throat. Evidence of blunt force trauma, each injury telling a story of violence, of suffering, of a final struggle against a fate she never saw coming. And then, there was Nicholas. A 19-year-old whose life had been shaped by rejection, by loneliness, by battles waged within himself long before Mary ever entered the picture. He had struggled with his identity, torn between who he was and who the world expected him to be. His family had turned away from him, his own reflection had become a stranger. And in Mary, perhaps he saw something that threatened him. A force too strong, too unwavering, too certain in its beliefs. She had tried to offer him salvation. He had answered with something else entirely. Nicholas Gutierrez sat in the small interrogation room, his hands resting flat against the metal table. His face was still, almost empty, but his eyes flickered, searching, calculating. The officers on the other side of the table had seen that look before. It wasn't fear, at least, not yet. It was something else. A quiet resistance, the kind that builds walls and convinces itself they will never be broken down. They started with the questions. Simple ones at first. Where had he been that day? Had he seen Mary Stalage? Had she come to his apartment? He answered each one without hesitation. No, he hadn't seen her. No, she hadn't visited him. No, he had no idea where she could be. His voice was steady, rehearsed. He thought he had control of the narrative. But what Nicholas didn't know was that the officers weren't fishing for answers. They already had them. They knew Mary had entered the building and never left. They had found her beneath his floorboards, her body telling the story that he was trying so hard to bury. They had the evidence, the timeline, the motive waiting to be unearthed. They just needed him to break. And so, they pressed harder. They told him about the witness statements, the smell that had led them to the crawlspace, the wounds on Mary's body. They told him about the fibers that matched the carpet in his apartment, about the blood, the fingerprints. They laid it all out in front of him, piece by piece, until there was nowhere left for him to hide. Nicholas's breathing changed first. It became shallow, uneven. His hands, once still, twitched slightly against the table. His gaze dropped. He ran his tongue over his lips, swallowed, tried to regain the control that was slipping through his fingers. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "She wouldn't stop." It started as a murmur, a fragmented confession, tangled between half-truths and justifications. He told them Mary had come that day, just like she always did, speaking about God, about faith, about sin and redemption. He said she was trying to change him, to make him someone he wasn't. That she called his life unnatural, that she told him he could still be saved. And something inside him, something buried deep beneath years of rejection, loneliness, and confusion, snapped. His words spilled out faster now, tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to explain the inexplicable. He hadn't planned it, he swore. He hadn't meant for it to happen. One moment, she was standing there, her voice filling the small apartment, and the next, he was hitting her. He didn't even remember grabbing the knife. Didn't remember wrapping his hands around her throat. Only the rage. The all-consuming, blinding rage that took over and left him standing over her lifeless body, the air thick with the smell of iron, his hands shaking, his mind an empty void. When he finally stopped speaking, the room fell silent. The weight of what he had done hung in the air, pressing down on everyone inside. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. They had heard confessions before, had seen men crumble under the truth of their own actions. But something about this one, about the way Nicholas spoke as if he were both the villain and the victim, left a hollow feeling in the pit of their stomachs. Outside that room, the debate was already beginning. What had really happened between Mary and Nicholas? Was this a hate crime, an act of violence fueled by her faith and his resentment toward it? Or was it something else entirely, a personal battle that had reached its breaking point? Prosecutors and defense attorneys would argue the details, trying to fit the crime into a category that made sense. But the reality was, for Mary's family, for those who had known and loved her, the reason hardly mattered. Because Mary was gone. And no explanation, no courtroom deliberation, no sentence handed down would ever bring her back. Nicholas Gutierrez sat in the courtroom, his face unreadable as the charges were read aloud. First-degree murder. The words echoed through the chamber, carrying the weight of what he had done. The prosecution laid out their case with precision, detailing the horror of Mary's final moments. They spoke of the brutality of the attack, the calculated way he hid her body, the lies he spun in the days that followed. It was premeditated, they argued. It was murder in its purest form. But outside the courtroom, another battle was taking shape. This was not just a murder trial. This was a case that had ignited a firestorm, one that reached far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Christian groups across the country saw Mary's death as something more than a violent crime. To them, she had been killed because of her faith. Because she had dared to share her beliefs with someone who did not want to hear them. They called for justice, demanding that Nicholas be charged with a hate crime, that his actions be recognized for what they truly were, an attack on Christianity itself. Yet, there were others who saw the case differently. LGBTQ+ advocates stepped forward, urging caution in how the story was framed. Nicholas, they argued, was not a monster. He was a young man who had struggled, who had faced rejection, who had been told time and time again that who he was made him unworthy of love. Was what he did wrong? Unquestionably. But was it as simple as faith versus identity? They didn't think so. To them, this was not a case of religious persecution. It was the tragic outcome of internalized pain, of wounds left unhealed for too long. And then there was the media. Or rather, the lack of it. In a time when high-profile crimes dominated the headlines, Mary Stalich's murder barely made a ripple beyond local news. It wasn't until advocacy groups began speaking out that people started asking questions. Why wasn't her case being covered like others? Why did some tragedies capture national attention while others faded into the background? And perhaps most controversially, if the roles had been reversed, if a gay teenager had been killed by a devout Christian, would the response have been different? The comparisons to Matthew Shepard's murder were immediate. People remembered how his death had shaken the nation, how his story had sparked movements and changed laws. But Mary, she was a footnote, a statistic. Her name was spoken in whispers. Her story confined to a handful of articles that would soon be lost in the endless churn of news cycles. For her family, it was another layer of grief. Not only had they lost her, but they now had to fight to keep her memory alive, to make sure that people understood who she was, what she stood for, and why her death mattered. Inside the courtroom, Nicholas's defense painted a picture of a deeply troubled young man, one who had acted in the heat of the moment. They spoke of his struggles, his isolation, the years of shame and fear that had shaped him. They asked the jury to see him not as a killer, but as a victim of his own circumstances. But no matter how much they tried to humanize him, the evidence remained. The crime scene, the confession, the brutality of what he had done. When the trial came to an end, the verdict was swift. Guilty. First-degree murder. As the words were spoken, Mary's family wept, holding each other as the weight of it all finally settled. Justice had been served, or at least, as much justice as the legal system could provide. But outside those walls, the conversations continued. Was this truly about faith? About identity? Or was it something even bigger? Something about the way society chooses which stories to tell, whose pain is acknowledged, and whose is forgotten. Mary was gone. Nicholas was going to prison. But the echoes of that day, of that crime, would linger far longer than the courtroom battle. Because in the end, this was never just one story. It was the reflection of a world that still struggled to understand itself, to reconcile belief with identity, and to decide whose suffering was worthy of remembrance. Nicholas Gutierrez stood before the court, his fate sealed long before the judge spoke the final words. Life in prison. No chance for freedom, no future beyond the walls that would soon become his world. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was handed down, the weight of justice pressing upon everyone present. There was no celebration, no triumphant cries for vengeance, just the quiet understanding that one life had been lost and another, in its own way, had ended. Mary Stalich's family clung to each other, their grief still raw despite the months that had passed. Justice had been served, they were told. The system had worked. But did it feel like justice? Did it truly bring peace? The loss of a mother, a friend, a woman whose only crime had been trying to offer faith to someone who did not want it. Was there any verdict that could ever make that right? And yet, for all the hours spent dissecting the crime, for all the arguments made in court, the debates that raged in the public sphere, there were questions left unanswered. What exactly had pushed Nicholas over the edge? Was it truly a moment of blind rage, or had something deeper, something more ingrained, driven him to act? The court had ruled against calling it a hate crime, citing a lack of concrete evidence. But the debate would never really die. Had Mary's words been too much for someone already battling inner demons? Or had her presence, her unwavering belief, simply been a convenient excuse for violence that was always bound to surface? There were those who argued that Mary should have never approached him in the first place. That faith, no matter how well intended, can feel like an attack to someone who has spent their life being told they are wrong for existing. But how far does that argument go? At what point does belief become an intrusion? At what point does rejection become justification for something far worse? Perhaps the tragedy of it all was that neither Mary nor Nicholas had ever truly seen each other. Mary had seen a soul in need of saving. Nicholas had seen an accusation, a reminder of all the pain that had come before. Two people, standing in the same room, speaking words that were never truly heard. And in that misunderstanding, in that moment of collision, lives were shattered. Beyond the courtroom, beyond the personal pain of those involved, there was something larger at play. A reflection of the world as it was, divided, tense, unwilling to find common ground. Faith against identity. Belief against self-acceptance. The lines had been drawn long before Mary knocked on Nicholas's door, and they would remain long after. There are stories that end neatly, with resolutions that tie every thread into place. This was not one of them. This was a story of tragedy, of conflict, of wounds that could not be healed by a verdict alone. Because when the courtroom doors closed, when the news cycles moved on, the questions remained. What happens when belief meets resistance? What happens when identity is challenged? And what happens when two people, bound by nothing but fate, collide in a moment that can never be undone? Maybe there are no answers. Maybe there never were. Some stories leave us unsettled. Some questions never find their answers. And in the end, we are left with only our own thoughts, our own interpretations of what truly happened. Was this a crime fueled by anger alone, a moment of uncontrollable rage? Or was there something deeper, something buried beneath years of pain, rejection, and internal struggle? Mary Stalage is gone, but her story lingers. It lingers in the minds of those who knew her, in the hearts of those who believe she was targeted for her faith. It lingers in the debates that continue, the arguments over whether words, no matter how well-intended, can push a person to the edge. It lingers in the quiet contemplation of a society that so often draws battle lines between belief and identity, never pausing to consider the real human cost. Nicholas Gutierrez will live out his days behind bars, the world beyond the prison walls moving on without him. But his story lingers, too, in the arguments of those who say he was a product of a world that never accepted him. In the conversations about trauma, about pain, about what happens when someone has nowhere left to turn. In the quiet whispers of those who wonder, if things had been different, if one moment had changed, would Mary still be alive? Would Nicholas still be free? Join the conversation by sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Have you or someone you know experienced a similar situation? How did you navigate the process of healing and rebuilding trust? Check out another video on our channel that explores the importance of trust and leadership in faith communities. This video offers practical advice and insights on how to foster a culture of transparency and accountability. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel Vic's True Crime Stories for more content on trust and personal growth. We appreciate your support and look forward to hearing your thoughts on this important topic.